Hey everybody, this is Brian from Carving is Fun, and this video is about a very important skill that you must learn when you're getting into whittling and wood carving, and that is finding the wood grain and determining which direction it is flowing. This is not a very hard skill to learn, and once you start seeing the little clues, it'll be very easy to find the wood grain from here on out. Alright, so let's start off at a little bit of a higher level so you understand what the wood grain actually is. This is a cut of Empress wood right here. Imagine if the tree was going straight up and down. The wood grain itself are the fibers that run the length of the tree straight up and down right here. You'll see different colorations of the lines, and they all kind of go in one uniform direction. That means the wood grain is going straight up and down in this case right now. And you can see on the top here, you'll see the rings and sometimes little pit marks right here. This is actually the wood grain shooting straight at you into the camera. So the wood grain is facing, going straight up and down towards you right here. And then this is the wood grain going straight up and down like the length of the tree here. So you can see that's pretty easy to identify. Some other woods can be a little bit trickier to do, or mostly if you already have it processed. Like this is some pine right here. You'll see that the wood grain is actually going left to right because of these little indicators that the line's going left to right. I'll put a picture on the screen so you get a better idea what I'm talking about. But you'll basically start seeing indicators and hints at which direction the wood grain is actually flowing. Not only that, when you look at it from a cross section, you'll start seeing hints at where the tree rings are. This is again the wood grain comes straight at you, and this is the wood grain going left to right. Some other woods are pretty easy to identify. Like this is a little bit of balsa. I'll put a picture on the screen too, but the wood grain is going from left to right. You can see the streaks of lines going left to right. That's telling you that direction. And then when you start looking at the wood grain coming straight up at you, you're going to see little divot marks and the hints at where the rings are. That's an indicator that the wood grain is facing you. Now, sometimes basswood itself can be a little bit tricky to determine because it's such a nice, soft, and uniform colored wood. But I'll have a picture on the screen as well. But you should be able to see little hints and colorations of the lines and fibers going from left to right. Basswood has a pretty nice fine wood grain on there, which makes it really nice to carve. But sometimes it can be hard to keep an eye on which direction it's going. So going from the side, you can get little indicators where the wood grain is, and then if you look at the end of the wood there, you'll start seeing where the lines of the tree rings are, and that's the wood grain coming at you. Now, in some cases, it'll be a little bit harder to find where the wood grain is, especially if you have some very fuzzy wood. This is air-dried basswood that I like to get from a guy on eBay. It carves really well, but it does look rough when it comes to you. It doesn't come super nice and smooth like these guys, but that's no problem for me. All you have to do is really just like shave off a little section of the wood, just like plane it off, and you'll start seeing the nice coloration of where the lines are. It's pretty easy to find. I just shave off a little piece of the wood and I know which direction the wood grain is going. But for the most part, when you get a longer piece of wood, the wood grain will go the length of the wood. That is 99% of the time from my experiences at least. Now a couple ways you would want to be cutting into the wood grain itself. The most basic one is cutting along with the wood grain. This is easy to do. It's basically the blade sliding in between the wood grain and peeling it off. Just keep in mind when you start cutting the wood grain from large section, you'll start splitting the wood, and it starts to prevent it from making a nice smooth cut. So keep that in mind when you start cutting a larger section like I'm doing here. Towards the end, you'll start hearing it and seeing it kind of ripping off the wood instead of smoothly cutting it. So in this case, I like to just more do smaller controlled cuts. Now another way to cut with the wood is cutting across the wood grain. So like I said, the wood grain is going left to right in this case. I will be slicing in a downward motion like at this angle, or straight down across the wood grain. So if I cut at an angle across the wood grain, I'm basically slicing going down across each of the fibers. It does make it harder to cut because cutting through the wood grain is a little bit harder. But if you start cutting straight into the wood grain, it does make it even harder to cut, and doing so will usually require a sharper knife. So a sharper knife will get you a nice smooth cut, like you see right there. If it starts to get very rough looking, you probably need to sharpen your knife. Now, the other instance where you'd be cutting into the wood grain is against the wood grain. So again, wood grain is going from left to right in this situation. If I wanted to slice up against this curve right here, with the wood grain going left to right, that would be cutting against the wood grain and is not ideal. And this is why. Because when you're pushing up against the wood grain right there, your blade is actually getting caught up on each of the fibers going across. So you'll start feeling that it comes really, really hard to push. And the cuts start becoming more jagged and it looks like it's chipping off. And if you apply too much force to it, let me see if I can get it here, because it will actually start splitting off the wood, like you saw right there. Get that chunk back over here, and you'll accidentally rip off a whole section of wood you don't want to do. So cutting up against the wood grain is not ideal, primarily because, well, you're going to be fighting the wood grain. You might accidentally split it, and you might accidentally damage your blade too, because you're applying a lot of force. And for each of those layers of the wood grain, the edge of the knife is wanting to catch on every single one of them as you're pushing up. So it's basically you're fighting the edge of the knife from wanting to go into the wood grain for each turn. In this case, you'd want to basically cut down across the wood grain instead of against the wood grain coming up. So cutting down across the wood grain would be the ideal situation. Now, if there is a situation where you need to cut up against the wood grain, like if it's a really tight spot, I do highly recommend a very, very sharp knife and cutting in a slicing motion and taking off little sections of wood. Don't push the blade up against the wood grain, because you're going to just rip it off and rip off the wood and probably damage your knife. But if you do slow and steady slicing motions, it will help. It will not completely alleviate the problem, like it's catching on right here, but it will help in those situations where you have to cut up against the wood grain. If you found the video helpful, go ahead and hit like. It lets me know that people are liking the videos, and lets me know what content to make for y'all. Thanks for watching, everybody, and have yourself a good day.